So this video, now we're starting. Okay, this video, Great Expectations, Chapter 19. It's going to be solely for Chapter 19 because this is what we see the end of the first stage of Pip's expectations. We were supposed to read it together in class today, or yesterday. We didn't have time, but where we left off with Chapter 18 is Pip comes into a great fortune, and we see a little attitude change. Now, Chapter 19 is going to start, we are on page 155, and Chapter 19 is going to start with Pip physically turning over a new leaf in his life. So they burned his indenture papers, pretty much burning what he thought and getting rid of what he thought was going to be his future career of being a blacksmith with Joe. So that is how we start, and Pip says that the mornings he always feels a little better than he does of the evenings. Now, it goes on, and we see on the top of page 156, I went to church with Joe and thought perhaps the clergymen wouldn't have read that about the rich man in the kingdom of heaven if he had known all. This is referencing a Bible verse that says that it's hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven, and this may just be a glimpse of some foreshadowing for us. But Pip hears this verse that day and takes it to heart and even mentions that this was a hard thing for him to hear. Now, he goes on about his day, and he talks about he's going to do stuff for his people once he gets his fortune. But quick after, we see a boastful attitude arise in Pip. We see it when he's talking about Joe, how he's describing Joe, when he's telling Biddy that she needs to continue to teach Joe because he would be ashamed, ultimately, of Joe if he were to try to take him in when he does gain this fortune. But he just starts feeling boastful in everything he does and in everywhere he goes, and this is because ultimately people start treating him differently, as we see. He has a conversation with Joe about how this is what he's always wanted, and Joe says he has no idea, and Pip's kind of bummed that he had no idea, but once again, Pip told no one except for Biddy a few chapters ago that he ever wanted to do any of this. Anyways, he talks to Biddy about still helping Joe. He is rude to Biddy. He always speaks to Biddy a little rough, honestly, and maybe because she's a woman relatively the same age as him. And now it's truly because I think he sees himself as being better than Biddy, and that's truly how he's feeling. Now, we know that Pip has to go get clothes for his travels because he has nothing for it. He got the money to go do that, and when he goes, they treat him like a nobody at first. They treat him like a nobody until Pip says, "Mr. Trabb, it's an unpleasant thing to have to mention." He does not think it's unpleasant at all, but we're on page 160. He says, "Mr. Trabb, it's an unpleasant thing to have to mention because it looks like boasting, but I have come into a handsome property." When he says this, immediately the switch flips with how Mr. Trabb is treating him. Mr. Trabb is treating him like a celebrity. Mr. Trabb is treating him how he would treat LeBron James if he walked into the classroom. Okay, he's doing everything for him, making sure everything's perfect, acting like he is the President of the United States walking into this place. Pip takes this and runs with it. It makes him feel pretty good, I think, because not only does Mr. Trabb treat him this way, but when every single person he encounters that day starts talking to him, even though he says he doesn't tell everyone that he's come across this handsome property, but the few people that he has to talk to and get things from that day, they treat him different than they ever would have treated him before, and that's so telling of society at this time. Everything was to please those who have money, because ultimately, if you do, you could end up like Pip, come into this handsome property and come into this estate. Anyways, the last stop that Pip needs to make this day is at Uncle Pumblechook's, and this interaction is absurd, and we know who Uncle Pumblechook is and how annoying he is as a character anyways. I mean, I say annoying, that's a personal opinion. But we know his characteristics and his personality trait anyways, and he is completely different to Pip than he has ever been. So let's go to where we see Uncle Pumblechook, which is going to be on page 162. We're nearing the bottom of it. Pumblechook greets Pip by saying, "My dear friend." Has he ever greeted Pip this way? Absolutely not. He has always talked to and around Pip as if he is lower than low simply because he's been a child and simply because of who he is. Uncle Pumblechook has always talked to Pip as though Uncle Pumblechook needed to help him. Now, Uncle Pumblechook sees Pip in a different light because he sees, Pip could now help me. So this whole interaction is insane. We see many times Uncle Pumblechook even asks if he can shake the hand of Pip. It's so awkward, it's so absurd, and Pip boosts this ego of Pumblechook's as well, makes him feel good. Now, is this good for Uncle Pumblechook? Absolutely not. He's already a super arrogant man. But Pip feeds into it just as Uncle Pumblechook is feeding into Pip. They are really boasting and just doing terrible things for both of their egos together. Now, we see an interesting occurrence that I reflect back to chapter 4. I think chapter 3 or 4. We see an interesting occurrence, and what does Uncle Pumblechook offer Pip in this chapter? He offers him wine, the best wine. And where did we see this before? We saw this with Uncle Pumblechook and the soldier, and I think it's very interesting. We see Uncle Pumblechook now treating Pip as though he is someone that he wants to impress, when before Uncle Pumblechook felt that he did everything and Mrs. Joe did everything for Pip. The interaction is absurd. It's crazy. Pip's drunk and leaves. The next interaction we have is going to be on page 166, where we are going to go pay a visit to Miss Havisham sometime later. The interaction with Miss Havisham is interesting as well because we know that Pip believes that Miss Havisham is his secret sponsor ultimately, and the interaction doesn't tell us yes for sure or no for sure, but it has some hints leading to what our idea or our thoughts may be. Miss Havisham says she has already talked with Jaggers, and she knows that this person is ultimately not named. So it seems like kind of a test for Pip, I think. And she doesn't have much to say. Just kind of leaves it with goodbye. She doesn't have much to say. Does tell him that he has a promising career and deserves it. So that's interesting. But it does a little for our minds to ease that maybe it's her, but we don't know for sure. However, after this interaction, I think Pip is even more convinced, which he's already convinced, but even more convinced that Miss Havisham is the person who is allowing him this opportunity. Now, after this, Pip goes back home to Biddy and Joe, and he has his evening, and then he has his morning, and he tells Joe that he does not want him to ultimately see him off. And that next morning is a hard morning on Pip. Ultimately, I think it was hard leaving Mrs. Joe, leaving Biddy, but it was super hard for Pip actually leaving Joe. Another sad part right here is how he describes Mrs. Joe, and just the things we see. I know Mrs. Joe was a hard person to like at one time, but you can't help but feel bad with the way that he describes her now. He says that, she has no idea that Pip's leaving, and that is honestly a heartbreaking situation and has to hurt Pip in some way. But he truly is really just hurt by leaving Joe. If we look at page 170, the last page, this is when Pip has gotten a ways away. And I think this quote is powerful, and this whole little section is something that people can relate to in their everyday lives, especially boys the age of Pip. But in the middle, the paragraph starts, "Heaven knows we need never be ashamed of our tears, for they are raining upon the blinding dust of earth, overlying our hard hearts." Wow, powerful. Let me keep going. "I was better after I had cried than before, more sorry, more aware of my own ingratitude, more gentle. If I had cried before, I should have had Joe with me then." These tears allow Pip to truly feel the sadness in him of leaving Joe. He had been blocking it out the entire time, but these tears and this release of emotion allows him to realize that he wishes desperately he would have done his goodbyes different, and then he thinks about it. He thinks about doing his goodbyes different. And then he's too far gone. He can't change or redo anything. And that's when we end on page 170 saying this is the end of the first stage of Pip's expectations. I wish we could have read this chapter in class together. We just didn't have the time, and we don't have the time. But it is so powerful. I did not cover everything, did not cover nearly everything. Please read it. All right. 20, 21, and 22 will be up in a few.